In a minute, we're going to be using Alchemy to set some stuff on fire, but first we'll need some things to set on fire. So let's go ahead and make a log. And to do that, I'm just going to take this default cube here and tap W about 4 times. In Sensei Format, that adds a subsurface modifier, and then pressing it more will increase the levels of it. And it also enables smooth shading. Anyway, I'm press tab to go into edit mode. Select this face over here, press E to extrude, and just extrude it out a little bit, and then E to extrude it one more time. Do the same basic thing over here. So now I've got kind of a simple, generic little log shape there. And I'm just going to apply this subsurface modifier so we've got a nice hardy piece of mesh here to work with. Okay, so since we're going to be doing this in cycles, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the cycles render engine. And over on my material tab of the properties panel, I'm going to open my library up, and of course we're just using the Alchemy base pack here. As you can see, we've got selected. And I'm going to add this bark oak raise AE material to our log, which I'll go ahead and rename this from cube to log down here in the outliner. Anytime you see the capital A, capital E in a material, the capital A and E stand for Alchemy effect, and the type of effect is raise. And raise AE materials will, as you can sort of see in the material preview, use Cycle's new true displacement feature. The Alchemy material library add-on will also automatically adjust all the settings that need to be changed, such as turning on experimental mode, adjusting material settings, as well as distribute any assets or modifiers that need to be added to the object to get immediately renderable results for the true displacement effects, which is really awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and press use. And thanks to Blender's new material viewport shading mode down here for cycles render, we can actually get a live update in the 3D view of a pretty good representation of procedurally generated materials such as this. Of course, we're not going to see the actual displacement of it until we render or do a render preview. And of course, it's going to look a lot different when it actually renders, but it's very helpful feedback to be able to do things like adjust the material live in the 3D view. So speaking of that, I'm going to press the Alchemy adjust button down here, which just gives us quick access to all the most relevant features of that material. And I'm going to use these buttons here to adjust the material surface of this object, otherwise known as texture space in Blender. So I can scale the overall texture space with this big button here. I can just drag up or drag down to increase the scale. So I want to go ahead and do that a little bit. And then I can use these buttons over here to adjust individual XYZ values of the texture surface. So for instance, I want to stretch this out a bit, and maybe this one some too, and then maybe scale the overall thing back down just a little bit. And if I wanted to offset the texture here, I can use these buttons here to do that. We can also reset the whole texture space if we want by pressing this button if we weren't able to achieve the results we were looking for. So let's go ahead and give that a render preview to see what that's looking like. I'm going to press Shift Z, and looking pretty barkish, which is awesome. One thing going on here, I think the displacement of this might be a bit intense, so I want to drop that down some. But rather than going into the node editor and digging through all the nodes, which wouldn't be that big of a deal because I made this material so I know where everything is. But rather than doing that, what I can do is use this Alchemy color filter, which creates global controls over things like displacement, color, saturation, and so on across the material. So you get one simple, consistent menu, no matter what material you're using, or no matter how complex the material is. This is especially useful when you're trying to adjust, other people's materials, and you just want to do really simple stuff like change the basic color or saturation. So I'm going to press Add Color Filter, and when I do, I get this nice new menu of options here, which these are global controls. What actually happens is that Alchemy builds a node rig into the material and creates these global controls, which on their own won't affect the material at all until you begin to adjust one set of global controls. So for instance, if I wanted to change this bark's color, I could click over here, maybe make it blue, I guess. And then I can, if I increase this blend value, I can decide how much of that blue I would want in there. So say 0.8. And this lets me control all the relevant color information within the material. The filter actually is capable of making intelligent decisions about things that it needs to be plugged into and things it doesn't when adjusting colors by making assessments about the type of nodes being used and so on when it's building the rig. So it's really useful. So if you adjust one of these values and you're like, wait, you know what? I really don't think that's what I wanted to do to this material. You'll see a reset button pop up by each global control, and you can just press that to return it back to normal. But really all I wanted to do was drop this displacement down to, let's say, about 0.5, just cut it in half. And we'll get our little reset button there if we decide we don't like the change we made to those values. So if I press Shift Z, the bark is now looking a lot more reasonable. Another thing to keep in mind when you're using these raise AE materials, or basically true displacement materials for cycles, is that you're only going to get about half the quality during a render preview like this as you will when you go to do an actual render. Press Shift Z to head out of that. And of course, you can control the render detail of the raised material with this little option here, which will manifest if the material you have on your object is a raise AE material or using cycles true displacement. And this dicing scale, as you can see, it says bigger equals faster render. So basically, the larger you make this number, the less work it will be putting on your graphics card or your CPU if you're not using GPU rendering, but the less detail you're going to get. Done with that, maybe adjust this, maybe just a little bigger overall. I think I like that. Go ahead and press hide to hide all those adjustment features. Okay, so our log's looking pretty good thus far, only the ends don't exactly look like you would expect the ends of a cut log to look. This looks sort of like the log was cut and then somehow magically, or in some sort of weird biogenetic experiment, the bark has regrown over the wood areas, which is no good. So to fix this, we can use Alchemy's material painting feature to paint on some wood on both the ends of this log. Now, when we say material painting in Alchemy, we don't just mean like painting on a texture onto that object. We mean literally using the actual material properties of two different materials to paint with them. So all of the surface properties, displacement properties, translucency, transparency, shininess, displacement, what have you, you get the real effects of those materials painted on, which is super sweet. To select the wood, I'm just going to click on my Reality Palettes button, which gives me access to material categories. So I could just click wood here, and I want to use this wood rough cut here, which honestly doesn't look that great in the Alchemy material preview area here, but it looks a lot better when it renders, just trust me. Okay, so I've got that, close that out. And so to paint a material onto our object, we just select the material we want to paint with, press paint, and we can then immediately begin painting. Alchemy lets you do material painting with particle materials, Alchemy effect materials, Blender render, and cycles. But different material types will sometimes require different painting modes, but you don't have to worry about that. Alchemy will automatically transfer you to wherever you need to be, set up everything the way it needs to be, so you can just start painting as soon as you press the paintbrush button. And when you press finish painting, you'll be taken back to the mode you were in previously. Okay, so let's paint some wood onto the ends of this log. And to make this easier on myself, I'm going to press 3 to go into left view. That is if you're using Sensei Format. I'm going to press T. And if you're using Sensei Format, then you'll have access to either the Zero Brush Lite, which comes free with Sensei Format, or if you have the full version of Zero Brush, you'll have this as well. And in the full version of Zero Brush, we have this sweet hardness slider, which basically is just another way to control brush curve. It's just a lot quicker. And so I'm going to bring this hardness up pretty high and then paint on this wood. Go ahead and increase my strength of this brush too, and just paint this onto the end of this log here. Which right now, Blender's being really cool and letting us see the effects of both materials as we're painting. But occasionally when using material painting, because the procedurally generated materials live in the 3D viewport for cycles is a new feature, occasionally the material can get too complex for Blender to know how to represent it live in the 3D view. And it will the whole thing will just be orange or gray. It will still render out properly, but it just can't display it live in the 3D view. So if that ever happens, you can of course just switch to solid viewport shading, and at least you'll know where the material you're painting on where it's actually being laid down like this. And of course it will look right when it renders, but you might not get a representation of it in the 3D view, which no big deal. So press Alt Z, and so we've got that side. So let's do the other side. I'm gonna press 4. And I've got the brush hardness up really high, so it's looking a little chippy around the edges as I paint this on, but that actually works for what we're doing, which is, kind of like rough cut bark around where this wood's gonna be. Press Alt, tap middle mouse button to zoom in on this thing in Sensei Format. And let's give this a render preview, see what this is looking like here. Press Shift Z. And that's looking pretty sweet. I like how the wood rough cut has got this kind of like line going down it. Looks like a very natural tear of that wood, which is super cool. I think the edges of the bark are probably coming too far past the wood with that true displacement material, which actually modifies the mesh. So I think we'll need to extend the edge of the wood a little bit so it doesn't look like the bark's coming down past where it was cut. We'll press Shift Z to exit out of that. Press 3 again to go into left view. That is if you're using Sensei Format. If you're not, you'll have to press whatever it takes to get into left view. And I think I will switch this to solid viewport shading while I'm doing this, because also the procedurally generated material viewport stuff is awesome to look at and for making material adjustments, but it can also cause your computer to lag just a bit because it's, generating that stuff live when it normally does it when you're rendering. And press 4, get the other side. Okay, let's see how those guys are looking. There we go. All right, I'm really liking how that's looking. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift Z to get out of that. And now that we're done painting, we can go ahead and press Finish Painting here, and we are good to go. Okay, so I'm pretty much done with wood type materials. So I'm going to head back into my reality palettes there and press Alt, which returns the full view of the active library that you happen to be using. And press this to close out the palettes feature there. What I want to do now is go ahead and duplicate this log, so we've got 2 logs. But before I do that, I'm going to press 1 to go into front view, and G to grab, middle mouse constrain, and just get this sitting flush with the grid floor there. Then I'm going to press D to duplicate it, maybe press S to scale it a little bit so they don't look exactly the same or whatever. And maybe rotate this one, press R and then Z to lock this to rotate this away. And just so it's not sitting exactly perfectly. And then I'll select this other log and maybe go ahead and turn on my transform widget down here just to do some quick rotations of this like this. Just have it kind of sitting up on this thing here. And press 3 to go into left view, make sure it's sitting flush. One thing you want to keep in mind, since we're using a raise AE material, or basically a true displacement material, is that the displacement is going to cause the mesh to be increased from the size it is. So you have to take that into account. So when we're thinking about this thing laying on this thing, we need to think about the displacement that's going to be pushing this log out some, and the displacements that's going to be pushing this log out some. So we need to leave a little space between there. It's probably something like that. Now that I think about it, also, if we're thinking of this as our ground, we should also lift it up just a little. Okay, looks pretty nice. Going to get rid of that transform widget because it annoys the bejesus out of me 80% of the time. And let's press Shift Z, see what that's looking like. Wicked gnar, Tim. Awesome. Cool. Okay, so press Shift Z to get out of that. Let's go ahead and build like a little pit our logs to sit on, so maybe some kind of outdoor thing. So I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh add a cube, S to scale it up, and I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to pick one of these sides. Well, actually, let's go 5 to go into top view, and let's scale the whole thing down to where it's flush with the grid there. And then I'm going to select one of these sides. I'm going to go ahead and turn on snapping in the 3D view, so I can press E to extrude this out to this next grid line so it's nice and even. and then select these two and extrude those out. So now we've got like an even little extrusion of this side stuff here. Maybe go ahead and bring these guys out to 2 grid spaces rather than just 1. And I'm going to select this inner block here. I'm going to press Shift E to do an inset if you're using Sensei Format. If not, then press the button for an inset or look it up for default Blender. And E to extrude that down to something like that. And then I'm going to select this outer part and just extrude it up a bit. So now we have this kind of like fire pity thing. And I guess I'm going to scale it up and turn off snapping there because I don't really need it anymore. Scale it up large enough where our logs fit in there. Move it over. That's good. Now that I had to scale this up, I'm thinking maybe it's too big now. So I'm going to bring that in some. See for my circle paintbrush, just quickly make some selections, bring that in some, maybe bring this stuff down. Shift scroll down, Z for wireframe, B to do a border select, so I can select this bottom, all this bottom bit and bring it up some. So we've got something like that. Cool. So I'm going to press A to select all, 1 to go into front view, G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and just so I can have this sitting flush with the ground. And maybe just, scale the overall thing down here because it's a little big. I want to add a material to my fire pit, and so to do that, I'm going to click on this bricks raise AE, which as you can see is another true displacement material. And once again, the material preview of these new effects doesn't always perfectly represent what's going on here because, if the bricks looked like that, it would be pretty jacked, but they don't, so that's good. So with this object selected, let's press use. And that will, of course, distribute everything that needs to be distributed to use true displacement effects as well as adaptive subdivision and the modifiers required to make it all work and look nice. So let's press Alt-Z to change the big 3D view to material viewport shading from solid, which is what it was on. So we can see what this pit's looking like here. And actually, the bricks on here look pretty good. I don't know if I'll need to adjust them any. I think they're looking all right. Let's get a render preview and see what's going on here. Press Shift Z. Sweet. Our bricks are looking pretty sweet. Once again, there's no image being used with these bricks, no UV mapping, nothing. We just drag it on there onto the geometry and it looks pretty sick. So another really cool thing about all the brick materials that you can find within the Alchemy base pack library that comes with the Alchemy add-on is that all of the brick materials use a special type of generative mapping, which no matter how you adjust this mesh, it's always going to line up and be perfect and awesome. Basically, that is as far as like the all the walls of it go. So as you can see, I can extrude this stuff, extrude this out, and we just get perfectly mapped generating bricks wherever we pull stuff out. So we could extrude this up like this. We could even press Shift E, do an inset, pull this back in, and you can see even as I pull this back, it gets generated like perfectly into there, which is so fun and so cool, especially when combined with the fact that this is a raise AE material, which will automatically set up all you need to immediately get renderable results when you go to render. So with all this stuff, we can press Shift Z and immediately see all these totally killer displacement effects like this. Of course, you can use the adjust menu here to quickly adjust the texture space to get the alignment of the bricks however you need, or change their size or scale or whatever. But to me, this is super exciting. This is the way that I have dreamed of building and creating with Blender. The one drawback to these generative bricks is that the effects of the top part, the surface, and the bottom may not be exactly what you want. Although most of the time when you're dealing with like a floor or roof, you're going to have different objects with different materials dealing with that stuff anyway. But by and large, when it comes to like creating architectural walls or interior design walls of stuff, it's super awesome. I'm going to press Shift Z to get out of material viewport shading. And I want to just show you real quick in the node editor with this brick material, the secret to getting the bricks to always map to the wall perfectly. Basically, you need to use a texture coordinate node and connect the generated socket to a mapping node set to point. You link that to the vector part, and then under rotation, you set X at -90 and Y at 45 degrees. Then you run the vector part to a brick texture, and then from anything that you put out of that brick texture, it's always going to map the walls perfectly. Of course, you could adjust these rotation values to where it would always map the floor and ceilings perfectly if you were creating another kind of material. So just a quick tip there for building a really fun, basically Lego set of realistic architectural stuff. Switch this back to the 3D view, and I'm going to press Ctrl-Z to undo the effects to my fire pit here. So down here in my camera area of Sensei Format, which this kind of little area down here is called the director's chair, I'm going to adjust my camera just a little bit. And this is because I like to be thinking about my scene composition as I'm modeling a little bit, and just like to have an extra little eye on things. What I'm going to do is add the material to these two logs here at once. So I just press use. And of course, the instant you press use when you're using any effect material or even a particle material that's of the type emitter that can, like, do stuff when Blender is playing an animation, it will immediately begin playing, and you'll immediately see results that are renderable, that we could just render either an animation or render a still frame right now and see these fire effects. So the fire looks pretty sweet on its own. By default, the fire effects and fog effects will also generate an animated noise texture for the objects that they're put on whenever you use the material, which makes it look more realistic, which is really nice, which is why you see these animation keyframes pop up for the two logs there. It looks pretty cool. The smoke is getting a little cut off at the top here. This thing around these the logs that I added the fire to, this is called the domain box, and basically anytime you're using effects like fire or smoke or stuff like that, Blender needs a special box to cover all the areas where you want those effects to be, so it knows where to generate them. And as you can see down here in the outliner, that this Alchemy effect domain box is automatically generated and placed around the appropriate selection when you add the materials. So since fire and smoke and stuff can only live where this thing is, I'd like to make it a bit bigger so that the smoke has a bit more room. So I'm going to press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, G to grab, and maybe scale it up a bit. 5 going to top view, and just kind of put it over the entire little brick area where I think any smoke might wander off to or whatever. Now, when I started out creating this, I set up these effects to automatically use an adaptive domain for this domain effects box, which what that does is help conserve resources and get the most bang out of your buck for smoke effects, basically. However, I discovered that if we look in the settings here with this smoke adaptive domain option, if you have this activated, it's basically impossible to be able to render out a result that's going to reflect what you're actually seeing in the 3D view, which makes it kind of useless because you won't be able to know what your scene's actually going to look like, and it just overall degrades the quality of your final render, so I no longer have the effect using that, and I've experienced a lot better results because of this. Anyway, so we've all stretched all that junk out, but we can reset it by pressing back and pressing play again, and it will all form anew. You can press Alt-Z to switch back to material viewport shading. Now my smoke has a lot more room to billow and stuff. So we can see down here in my camera where I'm, sort of thinking about how I might render this final thing out, what stuff will maybe look like. Applying that fire AE effect to those two objects directly does look pretty cool. However, I think they look a bit like someone was given a can of lighter fluid and was really depressed and just wanted to burn the hell out of these logs and just covered every inch of it. And that's not super realistic or great looking. So rather than just bluntly applying the fire to these two objects, we can paint on where we want the fire instead, very simply, so we're going to do that. But first we need to get rid of the fire we did apply to these logs here. So all I need to do is select each of these, and under the Physics tab, turn off smoke. And then this will let me paint the fire onto them as though I had not added anything at all. I'm going to lay down the paint for this log here first. It's laying down flat. So all we do to paint fire or any other effect or particles or whatever we want is select the material we want to use and then press the paint button. And this will take us to the appropriate mode we need to paint and with whatever material type we were using. In this case, it happens to be weight paint, but you don't have to know that because Alchemy will take care of it for you. And then when you're done, you just press finish painting to hop back to wherever you were. I'm also going to, down here in my outliner, hide my fire pit, which I forgot to name. I'm going to go ahead and rename this to pit so it's easier to know what it is, and hide its visibility in the 3D viewport. And then back on this object here, all I have to do is paint where I want fire to go, which I think I want to have it, you know, like propping up around the bottoms and then coming over on the side here. And I definitely want it like starting to feed up here and then come up here, because that's where this other log is, where the fire would start to reach for, you know, and be pulled into burning more. And hold shift to erase here in weight paint. All right, so when we're done painting where we want effect material to be, fire, fog, smoke, whatever, we just press finish painting. And as soon as we do, the fire will begin to come from all the areas that we painted. It will immediately begin to play. These effects are immediately renderable and what have you. Okay, so that looks pretty dope. Let's go ahead and pause this, hit back, and paint where we want fire to go on this object here. Because we can paint fire onto as many objects as we want, just so long as they are within this domain box, because all the magic fire in the scene has to live inside the magic fire box. And so with fire selected here, we want to paint this onto this. We just press our paintbrush button. And by the way, you'll always know if something is paintable because this little paintbrush icon, if it's lit up like this, it means you can paint something. But if it's gray, that means you need to do something else or you can't paint. Okay, obviously we've got the fire coming up from here and it's like, you know, getting strong there. So we need to put the paint the fire onto there. I'm going to switch from my blur brush back to the draw brush there. Obviously the flame's going to be highest around here because we've already got the fire coming up like that. Maybe have it like running down the bottom some. And it's like, you know, catching down the bottom here. And maybe just a few random blotches of dudes that just got out of control, yo. We can, of course, come back and repaint whatever we want and edit it and change stuff if we're not happy with it. So I'm done with that. Going to press finish painting. And as soon as I do, I can see the fire effects come up here. Looking pretty stellar. I think probably some more fire along this side. I don't know why I feel like that makes sense for that log, but it does. So press pause, and whenever you've already painted something, you can get back into whatever paint mode you need to be in to continue painting it by pressing the paintbrush button, or you could just, if you remembered what mode it was in, you can manually just switch it. But, you know, up to you. I'm going to get the side of this guy some more. Maybe turn down my strength a lot. And, you know, maybe the flames aren't so intense, but they're still kind of, you know, here. And press finish painting. And I think this bottom block, too, needs a little more fire around its sides and such. So we'll select him and press paintbrush to get back to painting it. And I think maybe it's like, you know, creeping up around the edges there a little bit more. Mayhaps that makes a bit more sense. Press finish painting. So now we're using paint strokes to tell where we want this fire to go, on top of it using an animated noise texture, which is giving us super, super killer results that I love. But we can make it even better by increasing the smoke detail. In the same way, you have access to all your most relevant material options whenever you press the Alchemy Adjust button. We have access to effects for these Alchemy effect materials, such as the detail. We can also bake the fire effects straight from this menu, or release the bake by pressing that X button there. And the point of baking these fire effects is if you go ahead and bake it, then when you save your file and then you open it back up, you won't have to go to the end of the animation and press play for it to regenerate. Whatever frame you jump to, it will already be done. Blender will have already crunched the numbers and will know where the fire should go. But we can raise this detail here. So I'm going to raise it from 32 to about, I'm going to say 112. I don't want to get too crazy. And then I'm going to bake this. So these two values here, these are from which frames do you want to bake these fire effects. And I'm going to bake it from like frame 1 to about 250, which gives me a little bit of room to, play with and scroll through the animation and see, oh, you know what, I really like how the flame looks on frame, I don't know, 89 or frame 130 or whatever. So it just gives me a little creative room there. So I'm going to bake, which this does take quite a while. It's kind of like rendering, your image. The computer's got to like figure out a lot of stuff about where to put that smoke detail and then save it to disk. So I'm going to bake this and then I'll be back in just a second. Well, to you, it'll be just a second. To me, it'll be like 20 minutes. You can see it getting started up there. Okay, that's finished up, and man, that looks really, really great. That looks really good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn back the visibility of the fire pit back on. Go ahead and press hide here. Okay, so I want to go ahead and give this a test render because I'm dying to see what this will look like when it actually renders out. But before I do that, in my lights menu here in Sensei Format, I'm going to turn on quick lights, which basically adds a black background and these lights here that will light the scene whenever you do a render preview or an actual render, but otherwise they stay out of view. But if you're not using Sensei Format or Zero Brush, you can just adjust this in the world settings here. I'm going to turn down the brightness to about 8. Let's give this a small little sample test render. Maybe zoom in on the wood a little bit, the fire, because I'm really excited to see how that's going to look. Alright, so this is looking super legit. There are a few things I'd like to change here though. You notice me mentioning about since how these logs were using the bark oak raise AE material. Because those true displacement effects, like where it makes the mesh bigger and bulkier and actually manipulates the way the geometry looks, so we had to leave a little space between where the logs are resting on each other because we know it's going to get fatter when it renders. Same thing kind of going on with our fire pit here. Because these bricks are extending, it's kind of like a little too tight on our logs here. So if you notice down here in the camera view, there's like a little space between here. We can see that red brick and we can't really see that here because it's like so fat, and also I think it's coming up a little too high. So we'll have to make some adjustments to that. So let's go back to the 3D view, and I'm gonna click on my fire pit here. Let's see, I'm gonna press tab to go into edit mode, and I just want to make this overall thing wider here. So I'm gonna alt select this loop of faces in here, and let's see. Yeah, that's all I got selected. That's all I wanted selected. Scale, middle mouse to constrain, scale it out this away. Then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to scale it out this away. That gives my logs a little more breathing room here. Shift scroll down, vertex selection, Z for wireframe, B to do a border select, so I can select just this wall of stuff here. G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and bring it like this. So it's, a little closer in on stuff. Still want to make sure that it's got some room to breathe, because as we know, the true displacement effects are going to make this thing a little fatter than it otherwise would be. I think also I'm going to just do some general editing to this thing because just to make it look cooler. So I think I'm going to select all these bottom faces, G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, maybe bring it up to something like that, E to extrude. Maybe it's like a platform or something. Alt select this loop of faces here, press Shift E to do an inset, and then immediately click and double tap space to bring up my operator tools. This is of course the same menu that's normally here by default in regular Blender, but I typically keep this closed because it just gets too much in the way. And in Sensei Format, you can double tap space to bring up those same options as soon as you use a tool or add something. And I just want to adjust this depth of it so it extends out evenly. Maybe do that again. C to use my circle paintbrush select thingy. This Z to make sure I got everything selected I want. And E to extrude that out 1 brick width. And do the same basic thing here. Press Shift E. And that happened. That's good. I think I'll add some loop cuts here. 4 here. Shift W, add about 4 here too. Select this top bit of faces. Maybe bring these guys down to about here. And then just shift select to deselect these outer bits. E to extrude. And do the same thing here, just to give whatever this little fire pit thing is a little more style. And we can decide like where we want the top part, if we want the top part to be those the bricks sticking out, or like to be the filler grout stuff if we want. I'm going to press add color filter, which will add a color filter to it. And I'm just going to set its saturation to maybe 0.6. That might be too much. We'll see. And that, just washes these out a little bit so they don't look so brand new or whatever. I'm going to press hide. And I'd like to add some burning embers to this. So we actually have a burning embers particle material we can apply. So I could add this burning embers material directly to these 2 logs, but if I were to do that, the embers would just kind of float in every which direction. The reason being because the particle system that this material uses, it's an emitter, which means it's basically shooting stuff out like bullets. And part of its setting is that it uses the normal direction of the object it's on to know which direction to go. By normal, we just mean the direction that the polygon face is pointing. So, for instance, if I were to select this log and press Z to go into wireframe, so if I added this burning embers particle material to this, like it would basically shoot out from all the directions of these faces, which would not be great. What I'm actually going to do is just paint this particle material onto the actual fire pit underneath the areas where the logs would be, so it will just come up straight, which will make more sense. So I'm just going to select the fire pit, and there's basically 2 ways to paint with particles with Alchemy. The first way is the default way. If I were to just click this paintbrush button here, this would paint the material surface of this particle onto the ground, so it would be like glowing burny orange, and then also have the particles emit from that area, or if it was a hair type, be around that area. But in this case, I just want to paint with the particles themselves. So when you want to just paint with the particles rather than the material surface and particles, which this particular material has a lot of like nodes that jack into the particle system it uses, which is why it's not showing up in the preview, by the way. But if we want to paint with just the particles, we can click this button. And this lets us paint with just particles. So with the fire pit selected, we'll press paint now. And we're immediately taken wherever we need to go to paint, which in this case is weight paint. And we just paint where we want stuff to go, which is around here. Which if I press Z to go into wireframe, you can see I only have a few vertex points like actually under here, but that's really all I'll need, which is why it's so splotchy, but really not going to need more than that. And maybe shift paint around there because don't really need particle embers coming up from that area. All right, that looks about good. And then as soon as we're done, we can just press finish painting. And because it's an emitter type, it will immediately begin to play the effect, so we can get some renderable results like straight away. And it's going a bit laggy because I did a really high-res bake of this fire, but still it's pretty cool. You can see the embers floating up from out of the ground now in the 3D view. Of course, these are set to render tied in with particle properties, so like their speed and influences like that control how bright they'll get and such. Okay, so I'm going to press pause here. And looking at these particles, I can already tell I think they're probably maybe a bit too big. So what I can do is press this adjust menu. And of course, the Alchemy adjust menu gives us immediate access to all the most relevant stuff we need to control that type of material. So because this material uses particles, we can control the size of these particles as well as the parent. That's the overall total number of particles to be emitted. I think I'm going to drop down the size of these particles. Probably there. That probably makes a bit more sense. Go ahead and press hide here. Well, finally, before I go, I think it would be real cool to see like some grass and weeds and stuff around on the ground. And like to see the cool, like how they're lit by those flames on the ground would be sweet. So I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a plane, and press S to scale. We've got a little basic ground here, nothing too fancy. And then I'm going to add a dirt material to it and just press Use to add that. Maybe adjust this just a little bit. Maybe bring these values down to where it's not so stretched out there. Okay, it looks better. So we could either paint grass particles directly onto here, or we can just add. If you want to add another material, then just press the plus sign to add another material slot to your actual object. Otherwise, if I were to say, select this grass material and press Use, it would just overwrite that dirt material. So I'm going to press Use and use this particle material on here, which adds this grass to here, which is sweet. Any particle material that you find in a library will have this little particle sign by the material, as well as any particle material you create and add to whatever library you're using will always manifest there, so you can always know where a particle material is. Okay, so you can actually add as many particle materials to an object as you want. All you have to do is keep adding material slots here. You can also paint as many particle materials onto an object as you want. So I'm going to click on my categories button here and under this grass category, and with this particle paint button pressed down here, which will let me paint with just the particles of a material rather than the material surface and particles, I'm going to press paint, and this will let me paint where I want weeds to go on this plane. Only right now there's only about 4 vertex points on this plane, so it's not going to give me a lot of control to paint. So what I'm going to do is press Tab to go into edit mode and tap W a bunch of times to subdivide this plane here. Or if you're using Blender default, you would press W to bring up, I think, the specials menu and then select subdivide a bunch. Press Tab to exit that, and now we can paint where we want these weeds to go. So I'm also going to turn on the visibility of my camera here in the 3D view so I know, okay, that's the camera and that's what it's seeing. So now I know, which direction it's pointing to know where I want to lay down these weeds. Of course, the distribution of these weeds, they're going to be real tight when you first start painting, because basically the entire number of parent weeds are going to live in that little area. But we can adjust that here in the adjustments menu. You see with this particular object, we have grass and weeds on it, so we have little simple menus to control those. So I'm going to want to make the size of these weeds a bit bigger, grow them up some, just maybe they're a little more unruly. And I'm also going to want to turn down the total number of them to say about 1/4 of what it was, which was 1,000. Of course, it's actually going to render at 20 particles per parent particle, so there's 250 parent particles. And for every one of those that exists, we'll see 20 children render, so it's going to be a lot thicker. And just paint out where we want these to go. Scatter them to and fro. We get some going back behind there. Maybe bring up the size a bit more. Okay, that looks about good. And of course, whenever we're done painting, whatever type of painting we're doing, we can just press Finish Painting, and that will take us back to the mode we were in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and return my categories back to all to display all my materials in this library, and close up the category system there. So I'm just going to press Render here. Nice, looking pretty sweet thus far. A few things I think I want to change about this. One, I think I'll lower the mesh on this fire pit so that the top of these bricks end where like the grout, the cement part in between the bricks is, and not just like have these kind of half-bit bricks coming up there. And also the weeds are way too thick. I didn't realize how many would show up there, so I'd like to scatter that out just a bit. Well, that's going to about wrap us up for this one. I'm probably going to tweak this stuff a little bit before increasing my samples to something big and doing a nice good render. If you don't already own the Alchemy material library, you can click the link over here to get it, and I highly recommend it, or download the PDF manual to take a look at that for free to see some more of the features if you have questions. Of course, you can build, create, and save your own particle materials. A single particle material can consist of multiple particle systems. Those particle systems can use emitter, hair, objects, groups, etc. So you can make really elaborate particle materials. You can also create any of the alchemy effect materials such as raise, smoke, fog, or fire just by including the name of the effect such as raise AE in the material. So combine that with the fact that you can actually import and export your custom alchemy libraries. That means you can share, distribute, or sell your own library packs to other alchemy users, to other people who have purchased the alchemy add-on. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with this thing. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.